Hello, game theorists. So, in our last episode, we defined majority rule and plurality rule. So, under majority rule, you need 50% plus 1. Under plurality rule, you do not. You just need the most votes under plurality rule. So, here's an example. Let's say you have three candidates, A, B, and C. And let's say A gets 45% of the votes, and B gets 40%, C gets 15%. So under plurality rule, A would win because A has more votes than B or C, even though A is short of majority. Under majority rule, you need some kind of runoff to determine what's going to happen because no one got 50% plus 1. So there are a couple ways to do the runoffs. So one method that's used, this is used in a couple of things used in Georgia for the Senate. You have a runoff between the top two candidates. In this case, that would be A and B. In some other systems, you can eliminate the people at the bottom first. So in this case, that would be C. And then you just keep eliminating the ones who get the least votes in each round. If there are only three candidates in those two systems are equivalent, so it would be a second election between just A and B. So again, these two are equivalent in this case, but if you had, say, four candidates, A, B, C, and D was even less popular, you'd eliminate D first, have A versus B versus C, and then you have that election, and then you eliminate the least popular one there, but you have C again, and you go on to A versus B. So you have multiple rounds here until you get down to someone getting a majority. Now it's possible here that in this example that maybe all of our C voters prefer B over A. So if that happens, A would still win under plurality rule, but in a majority rule with a runoff between A versus B, then B would prevail by 55-45. So majority rule and plurality rule would give you different outcomes. Now, this over here is not just some theoretical possibility that never happened in real life. This has a name, and we've arguably seen it in real life several times. So this candidate C here, who is not very popular in their own, but can still affect the outcome of the election overall, they're a third-party spoiler. So this third-party candidate still has enough influence not to win the election, but to flip the outcome between A and B. I mentioned that we have seen this in real life. So one example you could argue is Ralph Nader from the Green Party in year 2000. So 2000 was a very, very close election decided by fewer than 1,000 ballots in Florida. Ralph Nader was a third-party candidate who got I don't recall exactly how many votes he got, but it was well above 1,000. And the Green Party is pretty reliably left-wing, so presumably those voters would prefer the Democrat or the Republican. So if Ralph Nader had not been on the ballot, the 2000 election probably would have been different. So under plurality rule, it's possible to get a third-party spoiler. So you have cases where A, so George Bush in 2000, could win a plurality rule election, but would lose head-to-head if this third-party spoiler were eliminated, or if he had majority rule in a runoff. Now, as a consequence of this, voters might do what we call strategic voting. By that we mean intentionally not voting for the candidate you like best. So back in 2000, maybe you really liked Ralph Nader. Maybe you thought he really was the best candidate. But you were afraid that if you voted for Nader, you'd be wasting your vote and allowing George Bush to win. So you might have voted for Al Gore instead, even though Al Gore is not your favorite candidate. So as a result, because if we have plurality rule, it kind of naturally creates a two-party system. So thinking about things from a very economics background, I think that competition's a good thing. We all know that perfect competition gives us better outcomes than monopolies or duopolies or other imperfectly competitive market structures. So a two-party system very much reduces competition, and that can be a bad thing for society. So that is one undesirable feature of plurality rule. Another issue with strategic voting is kind of goes to really the core of what democracy is supposed to be about. We have votes in order to reveal the will of the people. But if you're intentionally not voting for your preferred candidate, then your vote doesn't reveal your preference anymore. So the vote totals don't really reveal society's preferences anymore. So you're not really sure the winner of a plurality rule election really is the will of the people or not. So perhaps you're thinking after all this, okay, plurality rule sounds like a bad idea, so maybe majority rule is better. Well, majority rule has some problems too. Let's go talk about majority rule. So I mentioned there are two options for majority rule. You have the runoff, like we had in this example. So there's a top two runoff, and they're equivalent in this case. We could eliminate the bottom candidates. So the ones that are least popular got the least votes in round one. So one mechanism that's been proposed for a majority rule is what they call instant runoff voting, which you might have read about somewhere. It's got a little bit of media attention. I think some places use instant runoff. So you can imagine if you had, like, say, 8 candidates in the ballot, and you limit them one at a time if no one gets a majority. So you have 8 in the first round, then you have 7 in the second round, 6 in the third round. You're going to the polls an awful lot. It takes a really long time to decide an election. So there's some way to speed up and have only one election and still do this. That would be desirable. So here's how instant runoff works. So you have all the voters rank the candidates from their favorite to their least favorite. So you have one election there to reveal everyone's rankings for all the candidates. So that way you can save on having all these different elections over and over again to narrow down the field. So here's an example of how that might work. Oh, one very, very important thing I should throw in here. So a good thing about majority rule is that there's no third-party spoiler. That's a very important point. So, for example, going back to the 2000 election, again, maybe you're someone who likes Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate, but you're worried that if you vote for Ralph Nader, then that might allow George Bush to win, which happened under plurality rule. Well, under majority rule, Bush would need 50% plus 1 in order to prevail. So as long as you don't vote for Bush, you vote for Gore or for Nader, either way, you're not getting Bush any closer to that 50% plus 1, so voting for a third-party candidate doesn't let the other party win. So that's a good property about majority rule, but as we'll see, majority rule has some drawbacks as well. So I promised to give you an example of instant runoff, so let's do that. So all voters will rank all candidates, and we'll limit the ones at the bottom who are least popular sequentially. So let's say we have 4 voters who think this way. They think that A is the best, and then B, and then C. And you have 3 voters who prefer B first, and then A, and lastly C. And you have 2 voters who think C is the best, followed by B, and then A. So they all submit these preferences on their instant runoff ballots. They rank all the candidates, and now we gotta use majority rule to figure out what's gonna happen. So the first thing you can see is that no one gets a majority in round 1. A got the most top votes, 4 of them, but in a society of 9 voters, 4 is not a majority. So you have to have some kind of runoff. So A got the most first round votes, followed by B, and then C got the least first round votes. So you eliminate C in the instant runoff. So that means you have to have a runoff between A and B. So the runoff between A and B, these voters still pick A. These ones still pick B. These ones would like to vote for C, but C is not in the runoff. So their next best option is B. So they vote for B. So you have 2 votes for B from these 2 voters, and you have 3 votes for B from these voters, and you have 4 votes for A. So that's another example where the outcome under a majority rule is different from the outcome under a plurality rule. Under a plurality rule, A would have won because they got the most votes, 4, in round 1. Under majority rule, the instant runoff, then B would prevail. So importantly, you don't have to have an extra election to determine this runoff outcome. Just go back to the rankings for how these C voters rank A and B, and that tells you what happens in the runoff. So you only have to vote once to determine the outcome. So this is another example where if you had top 2 runoff between the top 2 vote getters, A and B, you get the same outcome. Though in general, this sequential elimination from the bottom and top 2 runoff are not always the same thing. So that's an example of how majority rule would work under instant runoff. In our next episode, we'll see what are the drawbacks to majority rule.